You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 4, Reality Check. Part 1, The Accident. Brian Sanders moved like a whisper of summer wind, his skateboard wheels rasping gently over worn asphalt under a sky that blushed the color of warm apricots. He had come to love this stretch of empty parking lot behind the old community center. The pavement bore scars of its own, cracks branching like veins beneath faded white lines, chipped curbs, and a loose scattering of pebbles. But to Brian, every imperfection of that abandoned lot was a familiar friend. It gave him a sense of freedom. Here, beneath the slanting afternoon light, he could shape the world according to his own rhythm. At 17, he wore confidence as easily as he did his sweat-dampened t-shirt and frayed jeans. His brown hair curled out from under a backward cap, eyes bright with a restless hunger. He'd been riding skateboards since the age of 10, starting with clumsy half-falls in his parents' driveway and evolving into a quiet mastery. Through the years, he'd polished his skills against concrete edges and wooden ramps, learned to control the tilt of his body, the shift of weight that let him soar for a split second, defying gravity in miniature. The board, scuffed and sticker-plastered, responded to his every subtle move. Late afternoons, when classes let out and the world opened, were dedicated to endless practice with a small group of friends. They were a ragtag bunch who laughed easily and tossed mild insults at one another's failed tricks, pushing each other to go faster, try harder, reach higher. Brian was neither the loudest nor the quietest among them, but he had a certain grace that drew the others in. He didn't boast of his skill. He simply let his board speak for him. When he attempted a kickflip, he did so with a smoothness that suggested no wasted movement. When he landed, it was with a delicate tap, as though gravity and he were old acquaintances who had worked out a private arrangement. That day started no differently. Summer hung in the air, pressing gently against the shoulders, making sweat bead along his hairline. Brian rolled along a strip of asphalt painted with the ghost of a faded hopscotch grid, his friends cheering and whooping as he warmed up. He hopped the board up a curb, pivoted on the tail, slid off again, testing the terrain. He soared over a makeshift ramp someone had cobbled together from old plywood. Each landing fed his confidence, a current of energy traveling from his feet into the board and back again. He felt no fear, only the heady sensation of possibility. In these moments, as sunbeams carved long shadows and laughter filled the spaces between heartbeats, he believed in something bigger. Call it freedom, call it art, call it escape. His friends cheered when he nailed a clean heel flip, and he grinned, running a hand over his forehead. His shirt clung slightly to his back. He was alive in a way that required no explanation. After a while, some of his friends needed to head home. Evening chores and family dinners beckoned. They parted with casual waves, already planning the next day's session. Brian lingered, enjoying the last dregs of sunlight. He rolled quietly along a back alley, savoring the quiet that settled in after their laughter died down. The town stretched around him in gentle silence. The low hum of distant traffic, the muffled bark of a dog, the faint scent of someone grilling steaks on a backyard patio. Ordinary signs of a day drifting toward evening. He wandered without a fixed destination, letting the skateboard's wheels crunch faint gravel and glide over small bumps. He considered heading to a known spot near the old library steps, a place where he could practice a series of jumps he'd been working on. The streets were emptier now. A few cars moved sluggishly along, headlights not yet on, as the sky still held enough light to see by. At a certain intersection, Brian paused, one foot braced against the curb, to catch his breath. His heart drummed steadily, not from exertion alone, but from the joy of motion. He pushed off again, rolling forward. The neighborhood had an easy familiarity: low fences, mailboxes, a tree with a tire swing in one yard. He was far from any heavy traffic. In his mind, this was his kingdom, a place that made sense on a deep, unspoken level. A distant roar of an engine caught his attention. He glanced over his shoulder. A sedan, he couldn't make out the color immediately, drifted on the far side of the street. Its movement seemed odd, as if the driver couldn't maintain a straight line. Frowning, Brian shrugged it off for a moment. People sometimes fumbled with their phones or tried to tune the radio. Still, something about that car's unsteady path tugged at his instincts. He continued rolling forward, reaching a stretch of sidewalk near a low stone wall. The car's engine sound grew louder, rumbling like an angry throat clearing itself. He looked back again, and now he could see that the car swayed between the lane and the shoulder. Its headlights flickered on suddenly, glaring in half-light. Brian's pulse quickened. There was recklessness in that movement. He slowed, placing both feet on the board to steady himself, eyes narrowing as he tried to predict the driver's trajectory. In seconds, it became obvious that the car was veering too close to the sidewalk. The driver must have lost control. Brian's mind raced. He was on a narrow stretch with a wall on one side and the street on the other. If the car jumped the curb, where would he go? His heart climbed into his throat as he saw the sedan lurch onto the sidewalk, the front bumper scraping concrete, sparks skittering beneath the chassis. Time stretched oddly, like taffy pulled thin. Brian had always relied on instinct and lightning reflexes to navigate obstacles, be they curbs, rails, or sudden pedestrians. But this was no ordinary obstacle. This was a machine barreling toward him, fueled by chaos and bad decisions, moving too fast and too unpredictably. He adjusted his stance on the board, bending his knees slightly, fingers curling into loose fists. Every muscle in his body tensed as he tried to judge the car's speed and angle. He inhaled, suddenly aware of every detail. The scent of gasoline wafting from the street, the echoing rumble of the engine rattling his eardrums, the hint of cologne mixed with sweat on his own skin. The car hurtled forward, headlights now illuminating Brian's figure. He saw the reflection in the windshield, his own silhouette caught like a startled deer. The driver, a blurred shape behind the glass, seemed oblivious. Perhaps drunk, perhaps panicked, perhaps both. There was no room to dart to the side. The stone wall blocked escape. The car would reach him in heartbeats. He knew what he had to do. The only move that made sense was the one thing he was best at: jumping. But not just any jump. He'd have to time it perfectly, lift the board at just the right instant. An ollie that would carry him over the hood of a car hurtling straight toward him. It was a maneuver he'd never attempted under such dire circumstances. He'd jumped over fire hydrants, over gaps between ledges, but never a car in motion. The adrenaline flooding his veins sharpened his senses. The skateboard seemed to hum beneath him, braced to follow his command. He bent his knees more, coiling like a spring. The car's front grille loomed larger. He could almost see the chipped paint on the bumper, a smeared insect carcass on the windshield, a tiny dent near the headlight. These details burned into his vision as if to taunt him. If he failed, this would be the last image he saw clearly. He exhaled. His heartbeat was a roar in his ears. The sound of the engine tore at the night's calm. Brian's world narrowed to this single moment, this fraction of a second where he either soared or shattered. Then he popped the tail of the board with a precise snap, sliding his front foot forward to lift the deck beneath him. His legs reacted with practiced certainty, honed over years of mastering each subtle shift in balance. The board rose, and so did he, body weight centered, arms slightly spread for equilibrium. He willed himself higher, as if gravity could be persuaded to look the other way for just an instant. Mid-jump, he caught a glimpse of the windshield passing beneath him. In that suspended time, he felt both terror and awe. The headlights dazzled below, and the engine's roar seemed to fade in his ears. He focused on the landing, on the trick's final flourish. If he came down too soon, he'd clip the fender. Too late, and he'd crash into the sidewalk beyond. He had to nail the landing perfectly. The board hovered under his feet, responding as though it were part of him. He guided it with subtle shifts of ankles and knees, aiming for the pavement just beyond the car's hood. The car, meanwhile, screamed forward, metal crushing into the lamppost just beyond. Sparks exploded as the lamppost shuddered and bent. The noise of metal on metal shrieked into the night. Brian descended, knees bending to absorb impact. Wheels touched pavement in a smooth roll. He had made it. The board didn't slip away, didn't catch on a stray stone. He landed, arms raised slightly to maintain balance, heart pounding a wild rhythm. Behind him, the car slammed fully into the streetlight pole, sending shards of glass and twisted metal scattering. He smelled burnt rubber, and his ears rang with the sound of the impact. He was alive. He stood there, chest heaving, and the reality settled in. The car had missed him. No, he had missed the car by soaring over it. His face felt hot. He struggled to catch his breath, lungs working like bellows. He could feel the texture of the pavement through the board's bearings, the gentle vibration of his knees. The lamppost now leaned at a precarious angle, casting a skewed glow. The car's driver slumped over the wheel, unmoving. A spidery crack marred the windshield. For a second, Brian could not think. He only felt the lingering surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, the aftertaste of close call prickling at his skin. His mind replayed the moment in flashes. Just seconds ago, he'd been free and weightless, a boy in flight. In another reality, though he didn't think of it that way, just sensed it in the tension of this instant. Things might have gone differently. If his timing had been off by a hair, if the car had swerved an inch more, if his footing had slipped on a single grain of gravel. He didn't let the thought fully form. Instead, he let the relief wash over him. He was standing, unbroken. Yet the air crackled with the understanding that this moment was a crossroads. A whisper beneath the pounding of his heart suggested that this scene, this collision of forces, metal, flesh, asphalt, could have produced a different outcome entirely. In that split second of decision, two potential paths had lain open, one leading to safety and the strange triumph of escaping unscathed, and another to something darker and irreversible. He felt those possibilities press against the back of his mind, not as a clear vision, but as a lingering weight. The night offered no commentary. A siren wailed in the distance, perhaps alerted by a neighbor's frantic call. The lamppost flickered, uncertain how to stand. Brian wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His face felt clammy, the cool air now oddly sharp against his skin. He was still holding the board, fingers wrapped so tightly around its edge that his knuckles whitened. He took a step forward, then another, muscles stiff and shaky. He moved closer to the crash site, where the hood of the car crumpled around the pole. The driver did not stir. Brian's stomach clenched. He had never seen an accident so violent, never been so close to danger that could have easily claimed him. His chest felt tight. He wanted to run, to find his friends, to feel the warmth of human voices around him. Yet something anchored him here, a need to understand what had just happened. The silence grew heavy again. The smell of burnt rubber and spilled gasoline hovered. He considered calling out, asking if the driver was okay, but his throat felt dry. He glanced around, looking for someone, anyone, else, but the street was empty except for the battered car and the broken lamppost. In the swirl of disjointed thoughts, he noted how easily the night had transformed from calm to calamity. A minute ago, he had been rolling along, a free spirit on four small wheels, thinking about what trick to practice next. Now he stood at the edge of a scene that felt like it belonged on the news, not in his familiar neighborhood streets. He turned his gaze down the street, where the siren's wail grew louder. Help would arrive soon. For now, though, he stood in the interval between danger and rescue. The adrenaline still buzzed in his veins, and he tried to slow his breathing, inhaling the metallic taste of the aftermath. He shifted his stance, the skateboard's tail tapping lightly against the sidewalk. Every sense felt magnified. He could almost count the cracks in the pavement under his feet, feel the microscopic shift in the lampost's angle as it strained against its twisted base. Another step forward. He dared a glance at the car's interior through the spider-webbed windshield. The driver's head lay turned at an odd angle. Brian felt a surge of nausea, turning away quickly. He focused on the rough texture of the streetlight's concrete base, the glimmer of broken glass scattered like cruel confetti. This was real. He had escaped by the narrowest margin. The path of his life had continued on one track because he managed that perfect ollie. Yet, as he tried not to dwell on it, a subtle realization flickered. Had he misjudged by just a fraction, everything would have changed. It wasn't a thought he wanted to entertain, but it lurked there, pressing against the edges of his awareness. The siren's cry rose in pitch, red and blue lights dancing at the far end of the block. Soon, paramedics and police would arrive, take stock of the situation, and ask him questions. He would answer with shaky words and halting phrases. For now, he felt suspended in time, as if caught in the final frame of a film reel before the next scene rolled on. He absently rubbed the back of his neck. The night was growing darker by the second, yet he could still make out faint details. A poster peeling off a telephone pole across the street, the angled shadow of a picket fence, the hollowed bark of a crooked tree. Ordinary things had gained a strange clarity, as though the near brush with tragedy sharpened his senses. A soft breeze rose, carrying the scent of a neighbor's cut grass. He let his shoulders relax just a fraction. Nothing would be the same about this evening. He knew that instinctively. He had confronted a kind of raw danger he never imagined facing. He had risen to meet it with skill and luck. He had survived. A car door slammed at the end of the block. Lights strobed across the pavement. Brian blinked, momentarily disoriented by the brightness. He stood his ground, skateboard still in hand, waiting for them to reach him. He would explain what happened, show them where he stood, how the car came out of nowhere, how he, somehow, managed to jump over it. Words might fail to capture the intensity of that split second, but he would try. He lowered his eyes, letting himself breathe slowly, carefully, in and out. The cool air soothing his lungs, the mild ache in his calves reminding him he was intact. He flexed his toes inside his battered sneakers, grateful for the simple fact that he could still feel them. It was such a small thing, yet suddenly monumental. The sirens crescendoed, a chorus of urgency echoing through empty streets. He took one final look at the ruined car, its front end crumpled into the pole, steam rising from the twisted metal. Then he looked down at his board, running a thumb along a scratch on its underside. This board, his companion in countless hours of practice and countless moments of soaring joy, had just played a role in saving his life. He held it firmly, anchoring himself to reality. Around the corner, the red and blue lights flared brighter. Voices shouted. Footsteps hurried closer. Soon, people would flood this scene. Medics kneeling by the car, police marking the ground, neighbors peeking from windows. The quiet tension of this moment would dissolve into a rush of questions and responsibilities. Yet for a breath longer, Brian stood at a silent crossroads. In the hush before they reached him, he felt the weight of understanding settle into his bones. Here, at this lonely intersection of fate, he had come face to face with a split second that defined who he was and who he could have been. A slight miscalculation, a twitch of muscle, and that same second might have ended him. The knowledge lived now inside his chest, electric and undeniable. A flashlight beam danced over the asphalt. He looked up, ready to speak, ready to acknowledge what had happened, ready to face whatever came next. The evening sky dimmed overhead, stars hiding behind a veil of distant city glow. Brian's heart slowed, steady now, resolute. The skateboard felt comforting under his fingertips, and he inhaled the scent of his own sweat and the lingering tang of burnt metal. He knew nothing else but that he was alive, and that somehow, in a world of shifting paths and fragile moments, he had managed to land on the safer side of fate's razor edge. Part 2. Adult Brian's Life. Brian Sanders straightened the cuffs of his tailored shirt, feeling the subtle hush of expensive fabric against his skin. Morning sunlight, diffused through tinted glass, gave the meeting room a muted, artificial calm. This space, marked by polished wood, discreet lighting, and silence thick with judgment, had become Brian's arena. He owned it with a particular detachment, a mastery of fine print and loopholes that seemed to elevate him above ordinary mortals. Here, no wheels scraped pavement, no laughter echoed, only hushed voices and the gentle tapping of pens against legal documents. He sat at the head of a long conference table. Around him were associates whose suits matched their hollow smiles. A row of legal binders lined the credenza, their spines stamped with dates, codes, and initials. The room smelled of lemon polish and stale ambition. This was Brian's kingdom now, an office suite perched high above city streets, where sunlight filtered in but never quite warmed anyone. He cleared his throat softly, tapping a neat stack of papers with the edge of a gold-plated pen. Across from him sat a junior associate, a young man with nervous hands and uncertain eyes. Brian's firm specialized in claims approvals, health, injury, life insurance, yet their reputation stemmed from a ruthlessly selective application of the rules. They were infamous for denying what others might have approved, citing arcane statutes that sent hopeful claimants reeling. It was a game that required a sharp mind and a colder heart. Brian had plenty of both. So, regarding the Hitchens claim, Brian said, letting each syllable land softly. His voice had aged into something quiet, yet firm, carrying a hint of dryness that warned listeners not to underestimate him. I trust you've all examined the precedent I mentioned. A murmur of assent. On the projection screen behind him, details scrolled by. Sam Hitchens, mid-30s, an injury that prevented him from working. The claim file flashed personal details and a sobering medical report. Brian's eyes flicked over them, uninterested in anything but the angle that would let him deny it. A senior colleague, Helena, adjusted her glasses and spoke in a clipped tone. There's the obvious route, citing the revised eligibility guidelines. But, as you noted, Sam might challenge that. He's got a decent lawyer. Brian nodded. He'd expected no less. People like Hitchens didn't give up easily. But the firm's strength lay in obscure corners of legislation, ancient permit regulations, and long-expired waivers. Check Section 42 of the Building Compensation Act from 100 years ago, Brian said, leaning back in his chair. A faint smirk touched his lips. His workplace injury may not qualify under that archaic clause. The property permit granted at that time did not cover the sort of modifications he claims caused his accident. Therefore, technically, we can reject liability. A silence fell. He heard someone shift in their seat, perhaps uneasy. Brian didn't care. He knew the feeling well. Those tiny twinges of discomfort were natural. But as he often reminded himself, it wasn't his job to rewrite the rules. He merely enforced them. Inside, a small voice tugged at him. Did this man, Hitchens, deserve such cruelty? The question formed unbidden, like a seed caught in a gust of wind. Brian dismissed it. He didn't write the laws. He didn't choose the system's architecture. He merely operated it efficiently. That was the mantra he repeated whenever a shadow of doubt crept into his mind. Efficiency, profitability, adherence to legal frameworks. These were the guideposts of his career. He tapped his pen once more, a sign the meeting was nearing its end. We'll proceed with the denial based on that century-old permit statute, he said, tone unwavering. Send the standard letter. Include the references, make it airtight. The associates nodded, collecting their notes. As the team dispersed, Brian rose calmly, smoothing his tie in the glass reflection. He saw a man in his early 40s, hair neatly cut, eyes steady, suit impeccable. A man who had traded daring leaps and casual laughter for crisp contracts and precise denials. He turned off the projector himself, preferring not to leave minor tasks to others. Efficiency in all things. In the corridor beyond the meeting room, staff parted to let him pass. He strode toward his private office with measured steps, ignoring the pastel artwork and potted plants meant to soften the firm's harshness. His assistant tried to catch his eye, but Brian merely nodded and closed his office door behind him. A moment's silence, then he flicked through emails. A lunch invitation he would decline, a reminder about corporate ethics training, he almost laughed at that, and a message from accounting congratulating him on surpassing quarterly targets. Targets, benchmarks, goals. He excelled at all of it. Yet a faint heaviness settled in his chest, something he never named. He banished it by focusing on the screen, writing a terse reply to the accounting department. Noted. Thank you. And then logging off for the moment. It was nearing the end of the workday, and he had places to be. Home was a stately house in a comfortable suburb. Nothing ostentatious, yet large enough for a landscaped yard and extra rooms that no one truly needed. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the cars of neighbors glinting under late afternoon light, lawn sprinklers whirring. He stepped inside and caught the scent of dinner cooking, something with garlic and herbs. Mary, his wife, was in the kitchen, shoulders tense, hair pulled back hastily. She chopped vegetables with a brisk efficiency that rivaled his own, but hers was born of frustration rather than pride. "Home late again," she said, not bothering to mask her irritation. She didn't look up. "You missed Max's school thing. He had a presentation today." Her voice held a brittle edge, as if expecting another smooth excuse. Brian's jaw tightened. He removed his jacket, draping it over a chair. "Work ran over. I had a critical meeting." Mary set down the knife, turning to face him. Her gaze swept over his crisp attire and well-groomed appearance. She, by contrast, wore the fatigue of countless afternoons shouldering family duties alone. "I can't keep doing this," she said softly, anger simmering below the surface. Max was looking for you in the audience. He kept scanning the room, expecting you to show up. Sarah asked where you were as well. He let out a breath. I said I'd be busy. You always say that. And I always take care of everything. Household errands, parent-teacher meetings, last-minute school events. While you're, what? Denying people claims? Her words cut, though he would never admit the sting. He pressed his lips into a line. I provide for this family. You know how demanding the job is. And what about my demands, Brian? Mary's voice rose a notch. She pointed the knife at the cutting board for emphasis, not at him, but it felt pointed all the same. The kids want to see their father. I want a husband who's present, not just a paycheck. He ran a hand through his hair, resisting the urge to snap back. He was tired, hungry, and the last thing he needed was a lecture about family time. Yet, deep down, he recognized something hollow in his own defenses. Look, I'll try to make the next event, he said, voice low. Mary frowned, turning back to the vegetables. I've heard that before, she murmured. Her shoulders trembled slightly, either from anger or exhaustion. He couldn't tell which. Later that evening, they sat at the dining table. The children, Max and Sarah, recounted their day. Max's voice was subdued as he described his presentation, carefully avoiding eye contact with Brian. Sarah picked at her food, quietly mentioning a recital she had that weekend, a subtle reminder that he should attend. Brian nodded along, offering the occasional, "That's nice," or "Good job." The room felt too warm. He saw Mary watching him closely, measuring his reactions, the tension coiled beneath her tired gaze. After dinner, he retreated to his study, pretending he had emails to send. Instead, he stared at his desk, absorbing the silence. He flipped through a magazine he didn't care about. Outside, night settled quietly, stars hidden by suburban light pollution. He heard the children's footsteps overhead, their muffled laughter fading as bedtime approached. He should have been there to tuck them in, say goodnight, ask about their worries and dreams. Instead, he lingered here, behind a polished wooden door, the scent of leather-bound books failing to soothe him. The phone buzzed on his desk. He checked the caller ID, his mother, Nancy. It had been weeks since they'd talked. She lived across town, an aging voice on the other end of the line who never quite understood his world. He answered with a curt, "Hello?" Nancy's voice came through, hesitant and warm, asking how he was, wondering if he had time to drop by someday, perhaps help her with something around the house or just share a cup of coffee. Brian frowned. He scanned his calendar mentally. There was never enough room to fit in these personal obligations. "I'm swamped," he said, impatience creeping into his tone. "We have a big caseload at the firm. Maybe next week." She paused, disappointment audible in her silence. "Well, I understand you're busy. Just don't forget about family." He cleared his throat. "I won't," he lied. Then he ended the call quickly, before the guilt could take root. Turning the phone face down, he stared at its blank backside as if it might reveal answers. He told himself he would call her back soon. Another promise easily made, just as easily broken. By the time he re-emerged from his study, the house had grown quiet. The children were likely in bed. Mary stood in the living room, arms folded, the television on mute. She wore an old t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair loose now, eyes shadowed with fatigue. When she looked at him, there was a sadness that outstripped anger. That was worse, he realized. Anger he could handle. Sadness was heavier, more genuine. "I talked to Max after dinner," she said softly. "He's wondering why you didn't come today. I tried to explain. He said he understands you're busy, but I could see the hurt on his face." Brian inhaled slowly. "Look, the firm is going through a lot right now. We're expanding, handling complex cases." He paused, searching for the right spin. "Everything I do for us." She stepped closer, no longer raising her voice. That made her words all the more piercing. "What good is it, Brian, if we never see you? If the kids grow up believing their father is a ghost who haunts the hallways late at night, never spending real time with them?" Her tone broke slightly, revealing a crack in the armor she wore daily. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He wanted to argue that success demanded sacrifice, that money and stability were worth a few missed events, that no one could fault him for working hard to secure their future. But the look in her eyes halted him. Mary didn't want rationalizations. She wanted presence, honesty, maybe a memory of who he used to be. Silence stretched, thick as fog. The muted television showed images he didn't register. He felt cornered in his own home, no legal loophole to escape through. The arguments he wielded at the office felt flimsy here. Eventually, he sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I can't change everything overnight," he said, voice softer now. "But I'll try." She studied him, as if trying to determine whether he meant it. Finally, she nodded, though the doubt remained in her eyes. "We've heard that before," she repeated, this time without anger, just resignation. They parted ways in the hallway, her footsteps heading upstairs while he lingered, staring at framed family photos on a side table. In these images, he stood beside Mary and the children, all smiles. In one, Max grinned toothlessly. Sarah perched on Brian's shoulders, and Mary's hand slipped casually around his waist. They looked like another family entirely, a happier one. A moment captured forever, even as real life drifted in another direction. Time weighed on him. He turned off the living room lamp, walked upstairs. The kids' doors were shut, faint nightlights glowing underneath. He paused at each door, listening to the hush inside. He wouldn't wake them now. What would he say? Instead, he moved on, pushing open the door to the master bedroom. Mary stood by the dresser, folding laundry with careful, deliberate motions. She didn't look at him as he stepped inside. The air between them felt delicate, as if one wrong word might crack their fragile detente. "I'll be home earlier tomorrow," he ventured, aware how hollow it sounded. He thought of pending deadlines at the office, of the Hitchens claim and others like it, waiting to be processed and rejected. That world demanded so much. Yet here, in this bedroom, the cost became tangible. She nodded slightly but said nothing. He crossed to his side of the bed, removing his tie, placing it neatly over a hanger. Outside, a street lamp glowed faintly through the curtains. He thought of the conversation with his mother earlier, another relationship left to wither under the weight of his excuses. He knew Nancy missed him, and that his dismissive tone would cling to her thoughts. He told himself again he'd find time. Another empty promise, but he preferred that lie to the truth, that he had set priorities that left little room for family. Mary finished folding the last shirt and slipped under the covers. She turned off her bedside lamp, her profile etched in dim light. Brian hesitated before doing the same. Once darkness settled, he listened to the rustle of sheets, the faint hum of the air conditioner. He reached out, but stopped short. He didn't know what comfort to offer. Words felt cheap, and gestures meaningless without follow-through. In this stillness, he recognized that while he could navigate ancient legal codes and cunningly deny claims, he was at a loss when confronted with emotional debts. Here, he had no centuries-old statutes to shield himself. The family he had built was slipping away from him in increments, and every missed event, every strained phone call, every half-hearted promise was another nail in a coffin of his own making. He closed his eyes, trying to summon sleep. Instead, he saw images of the conference room, the carefully managed loopholes that enriched him while impoverishing others. He saw Mary's tense shoulders, Max's downcast eyes, Sarah's hesitant questions. He imagined his mother's worried frown on the other end of a phone call he ended too soon. All these weighed on him like stones. Somewhere in the quiet darkness, he found a familiar rationalization. He did what he had to do. The world was tough. He played by its rules. He didn't create those rules, just enforced them to his advantage. Wasn't that what everyone aspired to? Success, security, a nice home? Yet the taste of that success had grown sour. He shifted under the sheets, trying to find a comfortable position, but the mattress offered no relief. Down the hall, he knew his children slept without his goodnight words. Across town, his mother waited in a quiet house, hoping he'd visit soon. And here, beside him, Mary lay still, breathing softly, having said everything she needed to say. No sudden epiphany struck him. He drifted into a restless sleep, clinging to denial. But even as he slept, the tension wound tighter. He was a man caught between roles, an efficient executor of rules in a sleek office, and a hollow presence in the home he paid for. The gulf between these roles widened by the day, and he lacked the courage to bridge it. As the night deepened, the house fell utterly silent, save for the gentle hum of appliances and the distant hush of suburban streets. In that silence, Brian breathed shallow and slow, his dreams uneasy. Morning would come, and with it another schedule packed with calls and meetings. Another chance to fail his family by choosing work over togetherness. Yet for now, he simply slept, a figure in a room gone dark, an uncomfortable weight pressing against his heart. He had chosen this path, step by step, though never admitting it outright. And with each passing day, it claimed a greater share of his life, leaving behind echoes of discontent and regret that he refused to name. Outside, a neighbor's porch light flickered and went out. The night pressed closer, as if to say, "This is your life, Brian Sanders. This is where you've ended up." He had no skateboard now, no carefree afternoons bathed in golden light. Only forms, laws, and the strained faces of those waiting for him to show up. He slept on, stubbornly ignoring the warnings etched into every disappointed glance, every unanswered call, every muffled sob in another room. The darkness offered no comfort, but it offered silence, and that would have to be enough. Part 3. Alternate Reality. Brian awakened to an overwhelming brightness that stabbed at his eyes the moment he tried to open them. It was as if he'd been dropped into a world of harsh white light, with nothing but pale shadows and vague shapes drifting in the periphery. He blinked, once, twice, struggling to clear the blur from his vision. The air felt too clean, as though scrubbed of any scent or dust. There were muted beeping noises, a slow, regular rhythm somewhere off to the side, and the distant hum of machinery he could not identify. He tried to move his arm, just to lift it a fraction, but his limbs responded sluggishly. His right side, in particular, felt as though it had been wrapped tightly in invisible cords. He managed to twitch a few fingers, but the movement was slow and tremulous. His body seemed foreign to him, weighed down by gravity in a way he had never experienced. He tried to swallow, found his throat dry, and when he inhaled, the air passed through something artificial in his neck. He coughed, or tried to, and the sound rattled unpleasantly. A sudden panic settled in. Where was he? This stark white room, these blank walls. He searched for something familiar, a poster, a window, anything. The ceiling was a uniform panel of white and muted gray, fitted with recessed lighting that glowed with a sterile brightness. To his left, there was a tall cabinet with smooth metal doors. To his right, a stand holding a complicated apparatus of tubes and wires. He tried to focus on the details. An IV pole, a monitor showing green lines that danced with his heartbeat, a small tray table with a plastic cup and straw. Everything reeked of a medical environment, but stripped of warmth or personal touches. He stirred again, attempting to lift his head. He realized, with a cold jolt, that he couldn't quite feel his body in the way he remembered. His right leg, his right arm, everything on that side responded as though dipped in thick syrup. They would move, but so slowly, so stiffly, that it was almost useless. His left side fared slightly better, but still not normal. He tried to form a fist, just to test his strength, but his fingers curled lazily, barely responding. His breathing came through a tube in his neck. He raised his left hand, shaky and uncertain, to feel what was there. His fingertips brushed plastic and gauze, something rigid holding open a small hole at the base of his neck. A tracheostomy. The realization struck him like a slap. He had seen these before in documentaries or hospital dramas, tubes placed to help patients breathe. Why did he need one? Before he could delve into that thought, the door opened quietly. He turned his head, or tried to, and saw a figure step inside. A nurse, wearing pale green scrubs, hair pulled back into a neat bun, face covered partially by a disposable mask. Her eyes, kind yet professionally distant, met his gaze. "Good morning, Brian," she said, as though greeting him after a routine sleep. Her voice held a calm, practiced warmth. "I see you're awake." He wanted to speak. He parted his lips and tried to form words, but what emerged was a dry rasp, barely a whisper of sound. His tongue felt thick, and when he attempted to force out a question, "Where am I?" his throat constricted around nothing but air. He coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that made his chest ache. The nurse approached his bedside, checking the monitors. He noticed her movements were confident, brisk, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. She pressed a button on one of the machines, then reached out and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your mother is here to see you," she said with a hint of cheer, as if announcing the arrival of a welcome guest. "I'll let her in now. Try to stay calm." His mother? Confusion roiled inside him. He wanted to say her name, to ask what was happening, but again he could only muster a hoarse murmur. The nurse stepped away, leaving the door slightly ajar. Moments later, he heard footsteps, lighter, more hurried, and a woman entered. She wore a bright floral shirt and carried a tote bag that rustled as she moved. Her face lit up when she saw him, and without hesitation, she crossed to his bedside. "Morning, sweetheart," she said brightly. Her voice held a familiar lilt, warm and comforting. She looked older than he remembered, lines at the corners of her eyes, hair with a few silver strands woven into the brown, but her smile was undeniably that of the woman who had tucked him in as a child. "I brought you some new shirts, and I got those snacks you like. They're in the bag here." She set the tote on a nearby chair. Brian blinked, struggling to understand this casual, cheerful tone. He felt trapped behind his own silence, able to respond only with widening eyes and shallow breaths. She leaned in, brushing a hand across his forehead as if checking for fever. He tried again to speak, managed a strained wheeze. His mother didn't seem alarmed. Instead, she nodded, as if his inability to speak was perfectly normal. "Don't strain yourself," she said gently. "We'll get speech therapy in this afternoon, just like always. I checked the schedule. Also, I mentioned to the nurses that we should rotate some of your physical therapy exercises. Keep those muscles working." She spoke as though discussing the weather, as if this life was routine. This life. The phrase rattled in his mind. She spoke about him as if he had always been like this. Weak, partially paralyzed, dependent on therapy. Had something terrible happened? Was he recovering from an accident or illness he couldn't remember? His memories felt fuzzy when he tried to grasp them, slipping away like fish darting from his fingers. He recalled something about a car, bright headlights, the taste of adrenaline in his throat. But that was distant and fractured, as if viewed through a dirty window. He forced his gaze back to his mother. She was unpacking clothes, holding them up for him to see. A soft t-shirt, sweatpants, socks. She chatted about mundane things. A television show she watched last night, a new cafe opening in town, a letter from a cousin who lived overseas. Everything seemed too normal for what he was experiencing. He lay there, tethered to tubes, body half unresponsive, and she spoke as if it were an ordinary Thursday afternoon. The nurse returned after a few minutes, glancing at Brian's monitors. She must have seen the confusion and distress etched on his face. "If you're feeling anxious, we can give you something to help you relax," she offered, voice steady. Brian managed a shake of his head, a barely perceptible movement. He tried again to speak, pushing air through his vocal cords, but the tracheostomy tube made it nearly impossible to form proper sounds. His mouth opened. A scratchy moan emerged. His mother turned, tilting her head sympathetically. "You sound better than yesterday," she said encouragingly, as if that was supposed to reassure him. Yesterday? He had no memory of yesterday. His heart pounded. He had to understand what was going on. He lifted his left arm slowly, an action that felt like lifting a lead weight, and reached for the bed rail. Metal met his fingertips. He pushed against it, trying to sit up. His torso responded sluggishly, and a weakness spread through his core. He managed to raise himself a fraction before his mother and the nurse gently pressed him back down. "Don't rush it," the nurse said firmly, her professional kindness laced with authority. "We don't want you straining your breathing tube. Relax." Relax? How could he relax? He wanted to scream, to demand explanations, to ask why he couldn't remember arriving here, why he felt as though he had awakened in a body that was no longer his own. Instead, he could only produce another hoarse croak, frustration mounting behind his eyes. His mother patted his hand. "I know, honey. It's tough, but you're doing so well. You've made so much progress lately." She said it with pride, as if he should be pleased at this vague notion of progress. He tried again to communicate, this time attempting to point at the door, at the window. If there was a window. He saw only white walls. Had he been moved to some kind of facility? The nurse noticed his agitated hand gestures and stepped closer. "Do you need something, Brian?" she asked. He lifted his index finger, pointing awkwardly at himself, then out into the air, trying to convey the question. "Where am I? What happened?" The nurse exchanged a glance with his mother, and they seemed to share an understanding he lacked. "You know where you are," the nurse said softly, as though speaking to a confused child. "You're in the care center, just like always. You've been here for quite some time. Everything is fine, and we'll help you with whatever you need. Just like always." The phrase chilled him. He shook his head, a small, trembling motion, trying to deny her words. There must be a mistake. He didn't remember this place. He tried to swing his legs over the side of the bed. His right leg barely responded. His left leg twitched unsteadily. Still, he persevered, grunting against the effort. Alarm rose in the nurse's eyes. "Brian, you know you shouldn't try to get up without assistance." Her tone sharpened. She stepped forward, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder. He twisted, intending to slip away, to find a door, a corridor, anything. Panic overrode caution. He needed to escape this bewildering nightmare. His mother's eyes widened. She moved aside as he tried to pull his torso upright. The sudden shift in his weight caused tubes to pull painfully, and the monitors beeped in protest. He didn't care. He had to stand, to run. Even though his legs were uncooperative, even though his lungs burned and his throat rasped with every labored breath, he fought against their gentle restraints. "Brian, calm down," the nurse insisted. Her voice rang with a note of urgency. "You'll hurt yourself." He wouldn't listen. Fear pulsed through him, a raw and animal instinct. He managed to swing his left foot off the bed, planting it awkwardly on the floor. His knee nearly buckled. He reached for a rolling table to steady himself. His mother cried out, telling him to be careful, but he ignored her pleas. Then a flurry of movement. Another staff member, he hadn't even noticed them enter, rushed toward him. Strong hands grasped him under the arms, lifting him back onto the bed. He kicked weakly, arms flailing. More hands arrived, pressing him down with gentle but unyielding force. "He's trying to run again," someone muttered. "We have a runner," called another voice, raised to summon help. "Runner!" The word cracked across his mind like thunder. Why would they call him that? The absurdity of the situation only fueled his panic. He fought, but his muscles refused to cooperate properly. His body, half numb and sluggish, betrayed him. His attempts at resistance resembled more of a slow-motion struggle than a genuine escape. He felt straps sliding over his wrists, securing him. Another around his chest, snug, but not painful. He tried to scream, but the sound that escaped was a muffled cough, air rattling in the tube at his throat. Tears stung his eyes. He had no idea why he was here, confined to this bed, weak and voiceless. The staff talked among themselves, their voices low and controlled. He caught fragments. "He's disoriented. Just a rough day. Get the sedative ready." His mother hovered nearby, her cheerful demeanor cracking slightly at the edges. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, forcing a wobbly smile onto her face, as if trying to reassure him that everything was all right. But nothing was right. Everything was wrong. He pulled against the restraints, tried to shake his head, to plead with his gaze. The nurse leaned over him, speaking softly now. "You need to rest. We'll help you calm down. This will make you feel better." A slight prick at his upper arm. He realized they had injected something into his IV line. Warmth spread through his veins, a sluggish tide that dulled the sharp edges of panic. His limbs, already heavy, became impossibly heavier. His heart thundered, then slowed as the medication took hold. His mother approached once more, her voice muffled through the haze creeping into his mind. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking his hair. "Just relax. We've got you." Her eyes shone with a complicated mixture of affection and regret, as though accustomed to these struggles. Brian wanted to shout, to ask what had happened to him, why he was imprisoned in this broken body, in this sterile room. Instead, darkness curled around the corners of his vision, pulling him down into a quiet space where panic surrendered to numb confusion. He tried one last time to resist, to lift a finger in protest. The finger rose a millimeter, then sank back onto the bed. His breathing steadied under the forced calm. He heard the beeps of the monitors slow to a steady, even pace. The voices of the staff faded into a soothing murmur, their words indistinct, like whispers through a wall. His mother's face hovered above him, the brightness of her floral shirt blurred by tears in his eyes. She dabbed at his cheek with a tissue, whispering gentle nonsense, the kind of soothing talk one might offer a frightened child. He realized with a dull ache that this might be how his life had been for some time. Her kindness, the nurse's patience, the sterile white walls, all of it. Then the lights above seemed to dim, or maybe it was just the sedative taking hold. The tension in his limbs eased, and he fell into a quiet, restless slumber. His last thought before sinking into that darkness was a jumble of confusion and fear. A silent question left unanswered. How did I end up here? He drifted, weightless and adrift, aware only of faint hums and the distant echo of footsteps in a hallway. The reality of this place pressed on him, heavy and relentless, even as he escaped into sleep. Outside, the world carried on as if everything were normal, while inside him a storm of questions brewed. But for now, there would be no running, no speaking, no understanding, only the gentle hush of medication and the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Part 4. Learning about the alternate reality. Brian awoke again to a haze of quiet voices and soft mechanical hums. He lay still, feeling the same heavy weight in his limbs, the same dryness in his throat, and the same foreign sensation of the breathing tube at his neck. This time, however, the chaos of his previous attempt to escape had faded. He could sense the lingering tension in the room, as if everyone had learned to be cautious around him, but things felt calmer. The straps that had once pinned him down were gone. He could shift slightly on the mattress, though each movement was laborious and slow. His eyes roamed the white-walled room, searching for something that would make sense of where he was and how he had ended up here. Moments later, the door opened and his mother stepped inside. She carried a gentle smile, one that tried to reassure him that everything was all right. Her floral shirt today was a different pattern, sunflowers this time, and she brought a small folding chair to sit beside his bed. He watched as she arranged a few personal items on a side table: a bottle of lotion, a framed photograph of a landscape, a stack of folded clothing. She did it all with an easy familiarity, as though she had been performing this routine for years. "Good morning," she said softly. There was no strain in her voice, no awkwardness. She greeted him like someone who expected him to be here, in this bed, day after day. Leaning forward, she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm glad you're calmer now," she added. "We had a bit of excitement earlier, didn't we?" Brian tried to answer, to form words, but only a faint rasp emerged. His tongue felt clumsy, his throat tight. He turned his head slightly, hoping his eyes could convey the storm of questions churning inside him. She seemed to understand that look. "I know you're confused," she said, settling into the chair. The overhead lights caught the silver in her hair. She looked older than the mother he remembered. Lines etched more deeply around her eyes, a certain weariness in her posture. Yet there was warmth and determination too, something that suggested she had faced many difficult mornings like this one. "I'll explain what I can." He listened, heart pounding. Her voice was soft and even, as if recounting a long story that both of them knew by heart, except he felt like a stranger to it. She began with the past, describing him as a teenager, a boy who loved skateboarding more than anything. She painted a picture of sunlit afternoons where he practiced tricks behind an old community center, of friends who cheered him on, of a confident young athlete who found joy in freedom of movement. He could remember that feeling, faintly, as if through a fog. He recalled the balance, the exhilaration, the perfection of timing as his board rose beneath him. But then her tone changed. She spoke of a particular day, late in his teenage years, when things went terribly wrong. She described how he had encountered a speeding car on a quiet street, how his attempt to avoid disaster had failed. In her account, there was no miraculous leap over the car's hood. Instead, there was a sickening collision, the sound of metal and bone and dreams shattering in an instant. She mentioned paramedics, surgery, frantic nights in intensive care. His breath caught at these words, and he felt a distant ache in his body, as though his muscles and bones remembered the violence even if his mind could not fully grasp it. According to her, the accident left him with a traumatic brain injury. His skull had taken a heavy blow, altering the delicate wiring of his brain. His windpipe collapsed in the incident, leaving him dependent on a tracheostomy tube to breathe. His motor skills suffered severely. She explained how the doctors worked hard to restore any semblance of function. He survived, but his body no longer responded to his commands with the grace he once took for granted. Movement became a struggle, slow, uncoordinated, partial. Speech, too, had turned into a battle that his throat and lungs could barely wage. Brian's chest tightened as he listened. He tried to lift his right hand to prove her wrong somehow, to show that he was not the broken person she described. But his fingers curled weakly, barely managing a trembling arc in the air before he let them fall back onto the bedding. His mother watched patiently, sadness flickering in her eyes but not overtaking her gentle smile. She spoke next of Fellows Manor, a long-term care facility. The name meant nothing to him, but she described it as a place designed to provide full-time care for individuals with severe disabilities, people who needed constant assistance and specialized therapies. This was his home now. The bright white room, the careful routine, the staff who knew him by name, the equipment that helped him breathe and maintain bodily functions, all of it was part of life at Fellows Manor. She told him how she came every day, without fail, to sit with him, bring him clothes, talk about the world outside these walls. She mentioned small milestones, a day he managed to lift a spoon with assistance, an afternoon when he stayed awake longer than usual, a therapy session where he responded to a certain stimulus. He saw pride in her face when she recalled these tiny victories, as if each one were a precious jewel salvaged from a wreck. But the words she spoke might as well have been knives. Each sentence cut deeper into his sense of self. He remembered being strong, agile, able to breeze through life's challenges with confidence. Now, according to this new narrative, he had spent years trapped in this weakened state, dependent on others for even the simplest tasks. His mother's calm acceptance of the situation only made it feel more suffocating. She acted as if he had always been like this, that this was simply the reality they both had learned to endure. He tried to speak again, and this time he managed a sound, a rattling wheeze that turned into a strained whisper. It was barely intelligible, but it carried a thread of desperate questioning. Why? How could this be him? He wanted to shout that he was not some helpless figure strapped to a bed in a manor for the disabled. He wanted to protest that he had been capable once, that he had dreams and ambition. Instead, his protests emerged as incoherent murmurs, his tongue rebelling, his throat refusing to give shape to his thoughts. She reached for his hand and held it gently. "I know it's hard," she said softly. "We've been through a lot, you and I. But you've survived things the doctors never thought you would. You've made progress, bit by bit. That counts for something." Her words were meant to comfort, he could tell. Yet they only fed his frustration. He didn't want to measure his existence in tiny increments of improvement. He didn't want to think of himself as someone who struggled to hold a spoon or stay awake. He remembered a version of himself who soared on a skateboard, who navigated life's streets with daring ease. Now he lay in a sterile bed, body uncooperative, voice stolen. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he resisted letting them fall. He would not give in to weakness. Not here. Not now. The nurse entered quietly, adjusting a few settings on the machines by his bedside. He watched the nurse's practiced efficiency, the mild compassion in her gaze, and felt both gratitude and resentment mingle. Gratitude because she was gentle, resentment because he needed her help at all. He could feel his heart drumming a rapid beat of helpless anger. This was not who he was supposed to be. And yet, according to his mother's patient explanations, this had been his reality for a very long time. He tried again to form words, to at least articulate a question. He wanted to ask how many years had passed, what his life had been like in the interim, what he had lost. But the struggle to speak only yielded pitiful croaks. His mother seemed to recognize his frustration and placed a straw near his lips, offering water. He sipped it clumsily, grateful for the cooling sensation in his throat, but hating that he couldn't even drink without assistance. "There's a speech therapist scheduled for tomorrow," his mother said, trying to sound encouraging. "They've been working on techniques that might help you communicate more clearly. You've done well before." She paused, then added, "And the physical therapy sessions have shown that you can regain some motor control with consistent effort. Remember the time you managed to move your leg through a full range of motion? That was a big day." He had no memory of that. Instead, he clung to the memory of leaping over curbs, rolling down streets with unshakable confidence. Now, even the smallest movement was a monumental task. He tried to lift his head a few centimeters, and it felt like straining against invisible chains. Anger flared inside him, hot and sharp. He resented the pity in their voices, the gentle tones they used as if he were a child. He resented the tubes, the monitors, and the facility's name, Fellows Manor, so pleasant and genteel, while he lay trapped like a caged bird. His mother began to describe his daily routine, the morning stretching exercises, the midday rest, the afternoon therapy sessions. She spoke of a world governed by careful timetables and routines that revolved entirely around his physical limitations. He wanted to scream that he did not accept this life, that he was not this helpless individual who measured progress in the angle of a knee bend or the clarity of a whispered vowel. But all he could do was glare at the ceiling, chest heaving with silent rage. He wondered if his mother sensed his fury. She kept talking, her voice unwavering, as if determined to ground him in this reality with her steady explanations. She mentioned that the staff here knew him well, that they understood his moods, that they celebrated his improvements. Improvement. The word struck him like a bitter pill. Improvement from what? This condition, this broken version of himself, was now the baseline against which every small gain was measured. His breathing grew uneven. He forced himself to inhale slowly, to calm the trembling in his limbs. He needed to think. If everything she said was true, if he had been injured so long ago and had lived this way for years, then what he remembered as strength and agility must be distant past. How could he have forgotten so much? Perhaps the brain injury had taken not just his coordination, but large swaths of memory as well. The idea made his stomach twist. What else had he lost? Who else had he known? What else had he done? But he could not voice these concerns, not with his throat locked in silence. He could only watch as his mother continued her gentle narrative, describing the day he first moved into Fellows Manor, how she decorated his room with items from his old life, how she made sure he had clothes that were comfortable and easy for the staff to help him wear. She spoke of little traditions they had formed, her reading to him from a book he once loved, playing music softly in the afternoons, celebrating birthdays with cake that he could barely taste due to his restricted diet. Each detail painted a portrait of a life he never imagined for himself. Every moment described sounded ordinary on the surface, yet each was imbued with the weight of his condition. He could feel frustration boiling inside him, a thick stew of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. He wanted to fling off the sheets, to stand tall and prove them all wrong. But his body refused. His right side remained stiff and sluggish. His lungs only allowed so many words to escape before they dissolved into rasping breaths. His mother took his hand again. He noticed how carefully she held it, her grip soft, as if afraid to hurt him. She smiled, though tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. "You've come so far," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. "I know it doesn't feel that way, but you have. And I'll be here, every day, just like I've always been. We'll keep trying. We'll keep working on it together." He stared at her, wanting to say that he was not satisfied, that he refused this narrative. He wanted to demand that she tell him there was a way out, a cure, a method to return to the life he remembered. Instead, the silence pressed in, broken only by the monitor's steady beep. Outside the small window, he finally noticed there was a window, partially obscured by a curtain. A pale light suggested late morning or early afternoon. Some world existed beyond these walls, a place he could not touch. Inside these walls, he was defined by limitations and therapy sessions, by nurses and tubes, by daily visits from a mother who had grown older while he remained trapped in a state of arrested progress. He closed his eyes, feeling tears slip down his cheeks. His mother dabbed them away with a tissue, cooing softly as if comforting a wounded animal. He detested the helplessness coursing through his veins. The confident, capable person he recalled being had vanished, replaced by someone who must celebrate the lifting of a spoon as a triumph. He could not reconcile these two versions of himself, and the effort to do so nearly made his head spin. His mother's explanations continued, steady and unwavering. She described the therapies he had tried, the doctors who came and went, the changes in medication. She spoke of how the staff at Fellows Manor cared deeply, how they treated everyone with respect. Her voice wove a tapestry of a life shaped entirely by his injuries, his disabilities, and his need for constant support. He pressed his head back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling with a mixture of despair and fury. There were no words he could muster that would break through this narrative. All he had was his ragged breath, his trembling hands, and the slow burn of frustration that simmered beneath every beat of his heart. Eventually, his mother fell quiet, watching him carefully. The silence stretched, charged with all the things he could not say. She understood he was upset. How could she not? She squeezed his hand lightly. "It's okay to feel angry," she said at last, gently. "You've been through so much. We will work through it, one step at a time." But he did not want baby steps. He wanted to reclaim the person he once was. He wanted to leap from this bed and show that he could be more than a patient, more than a helpless figure in a facility designed for those who could not care for themselves. The knowledge that he couldn't was a weight pressing down on his chest. His throat tightened around the breathing tube, and he squeezed his eyes shut, holding back another wave of tears. In the quiet that followed, the nurse returned with a clipboard, making notes, adjusting a knob on a machine. His mother remained by his side, her presence both comforting and infuriating. He couldn't decide if he was glad she was here or if her gentle acceptance only deepened the sense of loss. The beeping monitors continued their calm chorus, as if mocking his turmoil. He lay there, powerless to change a single detail of what she had described. He could only seethe in silence, clutching at fragmented memories of a boy who once soared on a skateboard, free and unbound, and now found himself tethered to a bed, bound by injuries that would not release their grip. Outside, the day wore on, as days do. Inside, his mother patted his hand and whispered reassurances he could barely stand to hear. He glared at the ceiling, fighting a war within himself, a war of acceptance and denial, of rage and longing. The sun moved behind the curtain, shifting the light in the room. He remained where he was, pinned by circumstance, unable to do anything but listen to the quiet hum of machines and the gentle rustle of his mother's clothes as she leaned forward to straighten his blankets. This was his life now, as she had so calmly explained. He had no choice but to endure it, moment by moment, breath by breath, clenched fist by trembling fist. He said nothing more, because he could not. Instead, he simmered in the knowledge that everything he remembered being had been replaced by something smaller, weaker, and wholly dependent on the kindness of others. Part 5. Encountering Mary and Seeing the Void. Brian stood on the threshold of the diner, the smell of frying onions and grilled cheese drifting into the sunlight. The doorway framed a small, bustling world, checkered floors, vinyl booths, and the hum of conversation as lunch-hour customers claimed their meals. Nancy's hand hovered near his elbow, ready to assist, but not smother. He gripped the walker with both hands, knuckles whitening, and took a careful step forward. Each pace felt calculated and wary, as if the tiles might shift under him at any moment. He'd practiced this dozens of times in therapy sessions, but doing it out in the real world, among strangers, left his heart thudding in his chest. A waitress glanced up from behind the counter, offered a friendly smile, and led them to a booth near the windows. The sun slanted in, catching dust motes in the air, and Nancy helped him ease onto the bench. He lowered himself slowly, muscles protesting. It wasn't graceful, but he managed. Once settled, he looked around, curious and nervous. It had been ages since he'd eaten anywhere but the care facility's dining hall. At least that's what the staff had said. The thought unsettled him, making him restless. Nancy went to place their order at the counter, leaving him alone to absorb the surroundings. The diner had a comfortable shabbiness. A jukebox in the corner that might or might not work, a chalkboard menu listing daily specials, and mismatched napkin holders. He spotted a family 2 booths down, a woman and a man with a young boy, laughing softly as they shared a plate of fries. The boy slurped a milkshake, leaving a ring of chocolate around his mouth, and the adults exchanged amused looks. He turned his gaze away, trying not to stare. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. His hair was neatly trimmed, but his posture still carried the stiffness of long confinement. He placed one hand in his lap, the other on the table, feeling the laminate surface under his palm. He needed something to ground him. This world felt both too familiar and too strange. Nancy returned with 2 glasses of water. She offered him a straw, and he nodded, grateful for small kindnesses, though he resented needing them. He sipped slowly, eyes drifting back to the family. The woman's profile stirred something in his memory. A tension coiled in his chest. There was a familiarity in the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw. He narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly, trying to place her. The angle changed as she turned to say something to the man beside her. He caught a glimpse of her eyes and hair, the shape of her shoulders beneath a simple blouse. The breath caught in his throat. He knew her. He knew her from a place beyond this quiet diner. Her name hovered on his tongue. Mary. Yes, that was it. Mary. A tremor passed through him. How did he know her? Questions tumbled in his mind. He remembered suddenly and vividly a different life. Mary as his wife, 2 children, Max and Sarah, his home, his work. The shock of recollection was like a punch to the stomach. He closed his eyes, struggling to reconcile these 2 worlds. He had spent so long in that other existence, standing tall, running a firm, making decisions. He recalled an office with windowed walls, legal documents scattered on a polished desk, and a family waiting for him at a suburban home. Had it all been a dream? Or was this the dream? When he reopened his eyes, Mary still sat there, but she wasn't looking at him. She was laughing at something the man said, and the man smiled back. They seemed comfortable with each other, their heads leaning in close. She reached out to brush a crumb from the man's shirt, an intimate, familiar gesture. The boy, her son, giggled at some private joke. Brian tried to spot any sign that she recognized him, some flicker in her gaze that would say, "I know you." But she never even glanced his way. His heart pounded as he took in every detail. Mary's hair was shorter than he remembered, pulled back with a simple clip. Her clothes looked worn but clean, the kind of outfit chosen for comfort over style. She didn't have the expensive watch he recalled buying her. No designer shoes. Her posture was relaxed yet alert, and when she turned to check on the boy, the tenderness in her eyes was unmistakable. This was a woman who cared deeply for her family. He tried to swallow, but his throat tightened. In that other life, he had wealth, a polished life, and Mary by his side. She had dressed elegantly, carried herself with a certain confidence. But there had been tension, distance, arguments. He remembered working late nights, missed recitals, disappointed looks. In that memory, Mary's smiles had grown rarer, her warmth strained. Yet here, in this ordinary diner, she radiated happiness. She might have fewer comforts, maybe less money, but her eyes glowed with contentment. She looked at this other man with a spark that Brian realized he had not seen in years. Years. That word echoed painfully. How long had it been since he truly saw Mary smile like that? He thought of the quiet dinners in that alternate memory, the business meetings that ran long, the times he glanced at his phone instead of her face. And now, she was someone else's partner, someone else's beloved, and apparently better off for it. The realization scalded him from the inside. Nancy, noticing his silence, placed a gentle hand on his forearm. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded stiffly, not trusting his voice. If he tried to speak now, he feared he'd choke on grief. He didn't want Nancy to know what was breaking inside him. This wasn't something words could fix. He forced himself to look away from Mary, to focus on the salt and pepper shakers in front of him. But his gaze was drawn back, like a compass needle turning north. He couldn't help it. That was Mary. The Mary he knew in another reality, and yet not his Mary at all. She didn't know him. She would have looked right past him if their eyes met. The child, her son, spilled a bit of soda, and Mary dabbed it up with a napkin, the small domestic crisis handled with practiced ease. She spoke to the boy with kindness and patience. Brian's mind drifted to memories of his own children. Max's proud grin when he accomplished something, Sarah's laughter. He remembered them vividly, as if touching a cherished photograph. Were they real? Did they exist here? The thought of them not existing, of them never having been born, sliced through him like a razor. The man with Mary reached for her hand. She let him take it, their fingers intertwining beneath the table's edge. That simple contact carried an intensity that made Brian's chest tighten. She looked at the man with a softness that Brian once believed belonged to him alone. He swallowed hard, his throat painful. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt ragged, as if he'd just run a marathon. He wanted to scream, to call her name, to remind her of who he was, who they had been. But what would that accomplish? She might think him mad, a stranger accosting her in a diner. His walker rested next to the booth. He imagined himself standing up, hobbling over, trying to explain that he remembered another life, that in that life he had been her husband, that they had children together. The absurdity of it made him tremble. He would sound unhinged, and he could barely move without pain. Even if he could stand steadily, what then? Approach and shatter her peace? Demand answers she wouldn't have? He noticed Mary's clothes again, simpler than he recalled, probably cheaper. The man wore a worn-out jacket. Their car, he guessed, might be older, their home modest. Yet Mary's smile was genuine, her laughter pure. Brian remembered how wealth had once cushioned their lives, but it never guaranteed joy. Now he saw what might have been if circumstances had diverged. She was happier without him. The realization sent a surge of anguish through him. Nancy must have sensed something was wrong. She nudged him gently. "Maybe we can take the food to go if it's too noisy here," she offered. He shook his head. He needed to witness this, needed to feel it fully. Avoiding the pain would solve nothing. He glanced at her to show he understood her concern, then looked down at the table, fighting the tears that pricked at his eyes. He would not cry here, not in front of everyone. The waitress approached with their plates, simple sandwiches and a side of soup for him. He mustered a weak smile, grateful for the distraction. He lifted the spoon with effort, hand unsteady, and sipped a mouthful. It tasted bland and metallic, but at least it kept his hands occupied. He forced himself to eat slowly, as if performing a penance, each bite a reminder of how his own life had unraveled. Between spoonfuls, he dared another glance at Mary's table. The family was preparing to leave. The man stood up, offering a hand to Mary, and she rose gracefully. Their son hopped down from the booth, tugging at his father's sleeve. Mary grabbed her purse, no fancy handbag, just a worn tote, and slung it over her shoulder. As they passed by, Brian tensed. He hoped, irrationally, that she would sense his presence, turn her head, and recognize something in his eyes. But she walked past without a flicker of recognition. She paused by the door, fishing for keys, her face thoughtful and calm. The man said something that made her giggle, and she bumped him gently with her hip, a playful gesture that spoke of comfort and closeness. They left, and the bell above the diner's door jingled softly. Brian stared at the empty booth they had vacated, trying to imagine Mary's voice echoing there. He remembered a different Mary, a strained smile in a large home, children's artwork pinned to a fridge, late nights waiting for him to come home from work. He remembered resentments, missed opportunities, and dreams deferred. Yet in that memory, he'd at least known her as his wife. Now he possessed nothing of her but the ache of knowing she was happier elsewhere. Nancy touched his hand lightly. "You sure you're all right?" she asked, voice low. He nodded, unable to speak. Any words would crack his composure. He forced himself to finish the meal, each bite tasteless. Outside, a car engine revved as Mary's family drove away, out of sight and out of his reach. He lingered over the last bites of his sandwich, head bowed slightly, as if studying the crumbs. Nancy waited patiently. No more questions. Perhaps she thought he was simply overwhelmed by being out in public, by the noise and the effort it took to move around. She couldn't possibly guess the torment unleashed in his mind. He remembered now, vividly. He had once had it all: comfort, stability, family. He had taken it for granted, assuming it would always be there. In that existence, he saw Mary's disappointed looks but shrugged them off, certain they'd have time later, certain that his ambitions justified his absences. He could recall moments where he chose work over her, phone calls over conversations, and now he faced the crushing truth that given a different path, she could thrive without him. She could find joy, love, and warmth in another's company. The diner's background noises swelled. Laughter at another table, the sizzle of the grill, a passing reference to a hometown baseball team. Life moved on around him, oblivious to his heartbreak. He yearned for some cosmic explanation, something that would tell him this was a test or a lesson. But there was no such comfort. Only the sting of seeing Mary's happiness unattached to him. Nancy eventually signaled for the check. He nodded, agreeing mutely, and she helped him slide out of the booth. He gripped the walker again, leaning heavily on it as he stood. His legs felt weaker than before, as if sorrow weighed them down. Step by step, he followed Nancy toward the exit. His gaze darted once more to the empty booth where Mary had sat, half expecting her ghost to appear, a final glance of recognition. Nothing awaited him there but a few scattered crumbs and a faint impression on the cushion. Outside, the day had brightened. Cars passed on the street, and a gentle breeze ruffled his hair. He took another step, walker scraping the pavement. Nancy stayed close, guiding him toward the car. His heart felt hollow, and he breathed in shallow drafts of fresh air, hoping it would ease the ache inside. It did not. As they approached the vehicle, Nancy unlocked the doors. He paused, turned his head, and stared down the block where he imagined Mary's car had gone. She would be living her life now, heading who knows where, smiling, talking, planning her afternoon with that family. He could almost see the shape of her happiness trailing behind them like a bright ribbon. He settled into the passenger seat with difficulty, shoulders hunched. Nancy started the engine, and they pulled away from the curb. The diner receded behind them, a small scene he would not soon forget. The silence in the car was thick, and he stared out the window, watching the scenery blur. He dared not close his eyes. He feared the images that would arise if he did. Mary's smile turned toward someone else, a life he once knew now slipping between his fingers like sand. His mind overflowed with questions, regrets, and a profound sense of loss. He would carry this pain with him, a reminder of what he had once taken for granted. The world passed by outside, unaware of the small tragedy that had unfolded in a diner booth, unseen and unacknowledged by everyone but him. Nancy drove on, the car's engine a steady hum, as Brian sat immobilized by sorrow. The taste of heartbreak lingered on his tongue, more bitter than any missed meal or hospital medication he'd ever endured. He stared straight ahead, holding on to the memory of Mary's laughter like a wound that would not close. Part 6. Bonding with Jake and Self-Reflection. Brian returned to his room with a heaviness that had nothing to do with his injured body. The door shut behind him with a soft click, leaving him in a hush broken only by the steady hum of medical equipment. The overhead lights were dimmed to a gentle glow, revealing a space divided in half. 2 beds, 2 nightstands, 2 sets of monitors. He had never given the room's other occupant much thought. Until now, the man on the far side had barely registered in Brian's mind, a distant presence obscured by his own struggles. His roommate, Jake, lay stretched on his bed, utterly still. The staff had introduced him once, in passing, noting that Jake couldn't speak or move much. Brian had nodded, not really listening. He had been too overwhelmed at the time by his own circumstances to care about a stranger's condition. Now, when Brian looked across the room, he noticed details he'd previously ignored. Jake's thin frame beneath the sheets, the slight sag of his shoulders, the dull sheen of a breathing device attached to his tracheostomy, much like Brian's own. A pair of brown eyes that never seemed to focus on anything, or maybe couldn't. No visitors ever came for Jake. No voices called his name. No familiar faces peered in to check on him. The staff tended to him mechanically, changing sheets, adjusting tubes, taking vitals, then moved on. It gave the room an eerie weight, as if half of it belonged to a world where no one cared to leave a personal mark. Brian wondered what that felt like, to float through days unseen, unacknowledged. In the evenings, Brian often sat propped up against pillows, staring out the small window or reading whatever book Nancy had brought him. He didn't interact with Jake. He wasn't even sure if Jake could understand him. He assumed that Jake's mind, trapped in a non-responsive body, might be lost somewhere unreachable. This assumption came without malice, just a casual indifference born of fatigue and self-absorption. Then, one night, everything changed. Brian had awakened to a muffled gasp. At first, he thought he'd dreamed it. He listened intently, the darkness pressing close. Another ragged sound reached him, a wet, choking noise. His heart kicked up. He fumbled for the call button near his bed, fingers clumsy in panic. He managed to slap the button. Lights flared on in the hallway. Footsteps approached quickly. When the nurse rushed in, Brian gestured frantically toward Jake, incapable of shouting. The nurse took one look and hurried to Jake's side, calling for assistance. Within moments, more staff arrived. They bent over Jake's bed, working swiftly, adjusting tubes, clearing airways, administering something Brian couldn't see. The flurry of activity ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Jake stabilized once more. His breathing returned to a faint but steady rhythm. As the nurses retreated, one lingered to thank Brian. He'd saved Jake's life by alerting them so quickly. Brian nodded, unsettled. He had never imagined himself in the role of a protector, especially not here. Yet, at that crucial moment, he had acted without hesitation. Something about Jake's vulnerable silence and stillness ignited a spark of empathy that cut through Brian's own misery. The next morning, Brian woke to the usual quiet. Jake lay there, unchanged, but Brian felt differently about him. He couldn't shake the image of Jake struggling for air in the middle of the night. No voice to cry out, no arms to flail. If Brian hadn't been awake, would Jake have simply slipped away, unnoticed? After breakfast, Brian maneuvered himself into a comfortable position and watched Jake more openly. He tried to gauge if there was any awareness in those distant eyes. When a nurse came by, Brian managed to croak a question. Did Jake understand anything? The nurse responded gently that they believed he did, on some level. It was hard to say how much, but they treated him as if he were listening. Encouraged by that notion, Brian hesitated, then whispered a greeting. It felt absurd. Jake gave no sign of hearing him. Still, Brian tried again, a few words here and there over the next few days. He began telling Jake small, inconsequential things, the weather report he overheard, the odd flavor of the pudding served at lunch, the new therapy exercise he managed in physical training. Jake's silence never broke, but something about speaking to him felt right, as though Brian were acknowledging his roommate's existence, respecting that a human soul lived behind those unblinking eyes. Meanwhile, Nancy continued her daily visits. She would appear in the afternoon with a bag of clothes or a thermos of soup or a paperback novel. Sometimes she brought small decorations, a cheerful calendar, a soft blanket, to brighten his side of the room. More than once, Brian noticed that after a few weeks, items vanished. A missing pair of socks, a scarf he had liked, a trinket she'd pinned to the wall. Nancy never seemed bothered by these disappearances. She simply replaced whatever was lost without complaint. He watched her actions closely. She never scolded him for losing things, never made a fuss. Even if he'd forgotten to express gratitude, she kept bringing what he needed. There was a quiet perseverance in her care, a love that asked for nothing in return. Brian found himself thinking back to how he had treated people in that other life. Had he ever given so freely without expecting praise or acknowledgement? In the stillness that defined his days, Brian's mind drifted over memories. He recalled the life of polished office floors, urgent phone calls, and high-stakes decisions that once felt so important. He remembered brushing off visits to his mother, ignoring her calls. He'd been so busy, always so busy. He imagined Nancy's voice on the phone, asking when he might stop by, maybe bring a grandchild's drawing to show her. He pictured himself making some excuse, explaining that deadlines loomed, or that a meeting ran late. He saw her disappointment as clearly as if it were painted on the walls. Now, Nancy sat by him without fail, no matter how unglamorous this place was, how tedious his condition. She never looked impatient. She folded his shirts with care, hemmed his trousers so they wouldn't bunch awkwardly on his weakened legs. If he spilled soup, she wiped it up with a smile. If he needed help adjusting a pillow, she did so, then asked if that felt better. He had once given little thought to her feelings, treating family as a background detail he could neglect at will. Here, her steady presence illuminated all the times he'd left her waiting. When the nurses came and went, they greeted Nancy fondly. She knew their names, asked after their weekends. Brian realized that these staff members saw Nancy as a daily fixture, a parent who never left her child's side. How many years had this been going on? How long had she carried the load of his care, while he remained trapped in silence or indifference? And what of his family, his wife and children from that other memory? He had been absent far too often. Sitting now, powerless in a bed, he could see how selfish it was to assume they would always understand. He remembered dismissing small requests from his children, attend a school play, watch a soccer game, thinking he'd make it up later. Later had come and gone, leaving him with regret. He wondered what their faces looked like when he wasn't there. Had they felt unloved, ignored, or simply accepted that he would never be fully present? Brian turned his eyes toward Jake. The man lay there, isolated in a way few could imagine, unable to ask for help, to show pain, to reassure anyone that he mattered. He had no one who visited, no Nancy to bring him shirts and socks, no family picture by the bed. This realization softened something in Brian's chest. Jake's existence brought perspective. Brian might be trapped in a broken body, might be struggling with overwhelming loss, but at least he had someone who cared, who came daily to ensure he did not slip between the cracks of time. So he began spending afternoons not just talking at Jake, but sitting quietly, perhaps reading aloud from a magazine, describing the faint view from the window, or murmuring nonsense just to fill the silence. He had no idea if Jake understood, but the act of acknowledging him was a tribute to their shared humanity. Brian came to see Jake's plight as a reminder that everyone deserved connection, even those who could not respond. During one of these quiet sessions, Nancy appeared with a thin sweater. She noticed Brian positioned closer to Jake's bed, the chair angled so Brian could face his roommate. She seemed pleased, offering no comment, only a nod. After she left, Brian examined the sweater's texture. It was soft, a deep, comforting color. He thought of how Nancy chose clothes carefully, never complaining when they wore out or vanished into the facility's laundry. He recalled times in that other life when he barely noted the clothes his mother wore, never asking about her day, never thanking her for the countless small kindnesses she offered even then. He lifted his gaze to Jake and said quietly, "You know, I haven't always been the best son." His voice rasped, the words taking effort, but he pressed on. "I took a lot for granted." Jake gave no sign of understanding, but Brian pressed his lips together and continued, as if confessing to a silent priest. "I overlooked the people who loved me, assumed they'd always be there." The hum of the machines answered him, steady and indifferent, but Brian found a certain relief in admitting these things out loud, even if just to himself. He remembered birthdays rushed through or forgotten, calls half listened to, hollow apologies for missed events. He remembered rolling his eyes at his mother's concern, treating it like an inconvenience. Now, as he witnessed Nancy's unwavering dedication, the irony stung. She had gained nothing from his past indifference, yet here she was, pouring love into a life he had nearly destroyed. Jake lay still, a figure carved in stone, and Brian's voice trailed off. He settled into silence, hearing only the subtle drone of medical devices and distant footsteps in the corridor. He didn't know how much time passed. Minutes, hours. It was all a blur in this place where schedules meant therapy sessions and medication rounds rather than business meetings and deadlines. When Nancy returned that evening, she brought fresh fruit, washed and cut into neat cubes. Brian took a moment to appreciate it before eating. The sweetness burst on his tongue, reminding him that once, flavor and sustenance were mere afterthoughts. Nancy watched him with a kind expression, unaware of the storm inside him. He tried to show gratitude with his eyes and the slight nods he could manage. He owed her that much, at least. The room's atmosphere had shifted subtly since he first arrived. The silence felt less oppressive now, more like a neutral canvas on which small acts of kindness could paint meaning. Brian took comfort in the thought that his mother's love had been a constant force, whether he recognized it or not. He saw it now in every simple gesture, each uncomplaining sacrifice. And Jake, though voiceless and inert, reminded Brian that he was not alone in suffering. There were others who lacked even the slender threads of connection he had taken so easily for granted. In the following days, Brian maintained his new routine. After physical therapy sessions, where he struggled to make his legs obey simple commands, he would return to the room and spend a few minutes talking to Jake. He spoke of trivial matters, how the soup tasted that day, the pattern on a nurse's scrubs, the dull ache in his shoulders after exercises. Sometimes he just sat quietly, letting Jake know he was not forgotten. Meanwhile, Nancy continued her quiet support. She never demanded his attention, never pestered him for explanations he couldn't give. Instead, she adapted seamlessly to his needs, bringing a steady stream of small comforts. When an item disappeared or got ruined, she replaced it without complaint. When he felt too tired to talk, she simply read a magazine aloud or hummed softly under her breath. Brian began to realize how much tenderness existed in these small routines. He saw how, in the absence of his old life's noise and distraction, he could finally recognize the true value of the relationships he'd taken lightly. He remembered a world where he dismissed his mother's calls, minimized family gatherings. He had wrapped himself in ambition, neglecting the hands that reached out to him. Now, lying in this bed, nothing came easily. Everything from speaking a sentence to flexing a muscle demanded effort. But it was in this fragile state that he found clarity. He understood now that kindness and loyalty were not merely background details. They were the bedrock of a life worth living. Jake's presence reinforced this lesson. Had anyone visited Jake today, yesterday, or the day before? Brian never saw any visitors. He began to look forward to sitting by Jake's bed, if only to whisper a few words that might acknowledge him as a person. He no longer saw Jake's silence as eerie. He saw it as a reminder that silence can hide immense loneliness. If Brian could ease that loneliness just a fraction, then his own struggles had purpose. At night, when the lights dimmed and the corridors grew quiet, Brian stared at the ceiling, thinking about what he had once considered important. He remembered contracts signed, deals closed, profits secured. How empty those achievements felt now, stacked against the gentle smile on Nancy's face. He had once believed the measure of a man lay in material success, in power, in efficiency. Yet here, in this facility, he saw that true wealth lay in simple human connection. Jake, unmoving and mute, taught him that. Nancy, steadfast and patient, exemplified it. He did not yet know how to act on these realizations. He felt trapped in his body, trapped in circumstances he couldn't control. But he carried these thoughts with him, letting them settle in his mind like seeds in fertile soil. Outside, life continued. Nurses changed shifts. Meals arrived and departed. Inside, Brian observed the flow of care and compassion, and learned from it. On one particularly quiet afternoon, as he watched dust motes swirl in a beam of sunlight, Brian heard a faint cough from Jake's bed. It might have been just a reflex, but Brian responded anyway, pressing the call button to ensure someone checked on him. A nurse came in, adjusted Jake's pillow, and left. Jake's breathing steadied. Brian felt a small satisfaction in knowing he had helped again. It was not heroic. It was ordinary kindness. But ordinary kindness, he had come to realize, mattered more than any grand gesture. Nancy arrived later, carrying a fresh stack of folded clothes. She smoothed them, placed them in the drawer, and smiled at Brian. He tried to speak, to tell her something meaningful, but his voice snagged on half-formed vowels. She patted his arm gently, as if to say she understood without words. As the day wore on, Brian listened to the soft breathing of his roommate and the distant murmur of staff in the hall. He reflected on the life he once knew and the people he had neglected. It weighed heavily on him, but in this sorrow, he found a strange clarity. He realized that even now, despite all he had lost, he had the chance to see things differently. He owed it to himself, and to those he cared about, to acknowledge how fragile and precious every bond truly was. He watched Nancy leave that evening, the door closing softly behind her. The silence settled again, but it no longer felt barren. Jake's presence, though silent, was real. Nancy's kindness lingered in the folded clothes and the faint scent of the soap she used. Brian lay awake, listening to his own breath and the rhythm of Jake's machines, and understood that he had finally begun to comprehend the value of what he once so carelessly dismissed. Part 7. The Return and Reconciliation. Brian drifted into wakefulness slowly, as though emerging from a deep, colorless ocean. He lay still, breathing in the subtle warmth of his sheets, his heart beating a steady rhythm. Something was different. He could feel it in the softness of the mattress beneath him, the familiar scent of clean linen, the distant hum of the household's morning routine. He hesitated to open his eyes, holding his breath as if the world might vanish if he acknowledged it too soon. He wanted to savor this comfort, to relish the sensation of normalcy that felt strangely precious today. His hand moved beneath the blanket, fingers curling gently, testing the reality of the bed's smooth surface. No stiff hospital sheets, no mechanical hum of medical devices. Instead, he sensed the faint rustle of a comforter he knew well, and the distant sound of water running in the adjoining bathroom. Slowly, he exhaled, allowing himself to imagine what he might see if he risked a glance. The warm, inviting tones of the bedroom walls, the framed photographs on the dresser, maybe even a ray of morning sunlight spilling in through the curtains. With a careful breath, Brian opened his eyes. The room greeted him like a long-lost friend. Cream-colored walls, neatly arranged furniture, and the subtle scent of Mary's favorite floral diffuser. He blinked, relieved beyond words. The air felt lighter here, the silence kinder. He turned his head slightly and spotted Mary near the closet, selecting a blouse with one hand while sipping coffee from a mug in the other. She wore a soft robe over her pajamas, her hair pinned up in a quick, practical style. Even from this angle, she looked graceful, and he could almost taste the gentle calm she brought to their home. He swallowed, emotion welling up unexpectedly. How many mornings had he taken this scene for granted? Mary dressing, the house stirring awake, the promise of another routine day. He realized he could have missed so many details before, hurrying through life without pausing to appreciate them. Today, he vowed to pay attention, to soak in every nuance. Quietly, he pushed himself up on one elbow. The bed dipped slightly beneath his weight. He watched Mary tilt her head, debating between two necklaces. She hadn't noticed he was awake yet. The mirror's angle didn't show him. He took a moment to admire the gentle curve of her neck, the way a strand of hair escaped its pin and curled at her temple. She had always been beautiful. He saw that now as though for the first time. He let himself feel grateful for the comfort of this familiar life. "Mary," he said softly. She startled, turning with a slight laugh. "You're awake. I didn't think you'd be up this early." Her tone was warm, but casual. This was their normal routine, after all. He felt a surge of tenderness. She had no idea how precious this mundane scene appeared to him now. Without warning, he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood. He crossed the room in a few quick steps. She raised an eyebrow, surprised by his sudden energy, but before she could speak, he wrapped his arms around her. He held her gently, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. He felt her shoulders tense momentarily, then relax into his embrace. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, voice thick with feeling he couldn't fully articulate. "I'm so glad to see you." Her soft chuckle was muffled against his chest. "Well, this is a warm welcome. Is something up?" "Only that I love you," he said quietly. He leaned back just enough to look at her face. She studied him, curious and amused, searching his eyes. Perhaps she noticed an intensity there that hadn't been present in a long time. "I love you too," she replied, reaching up to smooth his hair. "Everything okay?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to jar the fragile peace of this morning with complicated explanations he couldn't fully express. Instead, he found a simple truth. "I just realized how important you are, how important we all are. I need to make some changes, starting today." Mary's expression softened. "What kind of changes?" He smiled, pressing a light kiss to her forehead. "For one, I'm taking the day off." She laughed, surprised and pleased. "You? Taking a day off without a conference call or a meeting lined up in secret?" He grinned at her teasing. "I mean it. I'll call the office. Max and Sarah. Are they both up yet?" Mary shook her head. "Max might be stirring. Sarah sleeps like a rock. But they'll be getting ready for school soon." "Why?" "I want to spend the day together. All of us." He caught her hand, lacing their fingers. "Let's do something fun. Doesn't matter what. Just as long as we're together. And we'll invite Nancy too if she's free. I want the whole family." Mary's eyes widened, reflecting a mixture of delight and uncertainty. "That sounds wonderful, but it's not like you. Are you sure everything's okay?" Brian nodded earnestly. "Better than okay. I know I've been distracted, distant. I can't say why, but something woke me up to how much I've been missing. I don't want to lose another moment. Let's surprise the kids, call my mom, do something that reminds us how lucky we are." Mary searched his face, saw no hint of jest, and smiled tenderly. "All right," she said. "Let's do it. Though I can't imagine what got into you." He kissed her knuckles, then released her to make a call to his office. Mary turned back to the closet, a thoughtful smile on her lips. He marveled at how easily she accepted his sudden change of heart. She trusted him, believed in him. That faith humbled him. A short while later, they headed downstairs. The aroma of fresh coffee and toast filled the kitchen. Max, halfway through his cereal, did a double-take when he saw Brian enter. "Dad, you're dressed casual. Everything okay?" he asked, spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. Sarah stumbled in moments later, hair sticking out at odd angles, eyes heavy with sleep. She blinked in confusion as Brian greeted her with an enthusiastic hug. "Morning, Princess," he said cheerfully, ruffling her hair. She groaned in mock protest, but he saw her smirk. "I've got news," Brian announced, leaning against the counter. Mary hovered nearby, arms folded, watching him with an affectionate grin. "We're all playing hooky today. No work for me, no school for you two. Just this once. And I'm inviting Grandma Nancy to join us." Max raised his eyebrows, mouth curving into a delighted smile. Sarah squealed with delight, nearly spilling her juice. Mary laughed at the children's reactions, shaking her head in gentle disbelief. "Is this for real?" Max demanded. "Absolutely," Brian said. "I'll handle the calls. Today is family day." Sarah, bouncing on her toes, said, "Can we go to the park? Feed the ducks? And maybe visit that ice cream place you always say is too far out of the way?" "Anything you want," Brian replied without hesitation. "Let's start with a simple breakfast at home. Then we'll plan out the day. And Max, maybe you can pick a movie for tonight?" Max grinned ear to ear. The children chattered excitedly, tossing out ideas. A bike ride, a picnic, maybe a board game marathon. Mary listened, delighted by their enthusiasm. She caught Brian's eye, her gaze shining with gratitude. After a quick phone call to Nancy, who sounded pleasantly surprised by the invitation, Brian and Mary helped the kids get ready. There was laughter over mismatched socks, a brief squabble about which jacket Sarah wanted to wear, and playful teasing as Max insisted on bringing his camera to document the day. By mid-morning, they were all in the car, heading to the park. The sun was warm, the sky a clear blue canvas. Brian drove more slowly than usual, enjoying the scenery. Mary rolled down a window, letting the breeze wash over them. Max fiddled with his camera settings. Sarah hummed an off-key tune. Brian glanced at Mary's profile, how the sunlight caught in her hair, and felt a surge of happiness. He wanted to remember every second, imprinted on his mind. At the park, they spread out a blanket under a broad oak tree. Nancy joined them shortly afterward, a slight flush in her cheeks, eyes sparkling with pleasant surprise. She carried a basket of homemade cookies, which Sarah attacked immediately. Max snapped pictures, Grandma holding up a cookie, Dad laughing at something Sarah said, Mom brushing crumbs off Max's shirt, Sarah striking a silly pose. They fed ducks at the pond, the children giggling as the birds waddled close. Brian took turns pushing Sarah on the swings, while Mary and Nancy sat on a bench catching up. He watched them from a distance, noticing Nancy's hand resting lightly on Mary's arm, their heads bent close as they talked. He hadn't realized how much these two women, so important in his life, truly cared for each other. Today, he felt that care like a gentle current, carrying the family along together. When the sun rose higher, they decided on a short drive to the ice cream place Sarah mentioned. It was a modest shop, just a walk-up window and a few benches. Brian ordered a round of cones, surprising everyone by picking unusual flavors: lavender honey for Mary, pistachio for Max, mango sorbet for Sarah, and a double chocolate for Nancy. For himself, a classic vanilla, wanting nothing to distract from the sweetness of this moment. They licked their cones in comfortable silence, watching people pass by. A couple strolled hand in hand. A group of teenagers raced by on skateboards. Children chased a dog, laughing. Brian savored each spoonful, letting his family's presence fill the gaps he had once left empty. He recognized now that love thrived in these simple acts, these shared tastes and smiles. In the afternoon, they visited a small local fair that happened to be setting up in a nearby lot. Brightly colored flags, a carousel's cheerful music, and the aroma of kettle corn greeted them. The kids went on a mild spinning ride, laughing at their own dizziness. Nancy tested her aim at a ring toss, winning a small plush toy for Sarah. Brian and Mary strolled among the booths, occasionally meeting the children back at the carousel. Mary leaned into Brian's shoulder and murmured, "This is perfect," and he felt a catch in his throat. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky with peach and rose hues, they headed home. The house welcomed them with quiet warmth. Brian and Mary worked together in the kitchen, assembling a simple dinner: roast chicken, a fresh salad, warm bread. Max set the table, placing napkins with care, while Sarah arranged a tiny vase of wildflowers they'd picked at the park. Nancy helped carry dishes, humming softly. They settled around the dining table, passing plates, complimenting the food. The children chattered about the ducks, the fair rides, the funny faces Dad made trying new ice cream flavors. Nancy beamed with pride, and Mary's eyes shone with contentment. Brian watched them all, heart brimming with gratitude. As the meal wound down, Brian cleared his throat. He looked at Mary, then at each face in turn: Nancy, Max, Sarah, relishing the comfort in their eyes. "I want to say something," he began softly. The conversation hushed. Even the children sensed the seriousness in his tone. He took a deep breath. "I know I haven't always been present," he said, voice steady but emotional. "I've let work and distractions steal my time. I've treated what we have as though it would always be there, no matter how often I overlooked it. Today showed me how wrong I was. I'm sorry for the moments I missed, the times I put other things first." Mary's hand found his under the table, squeezing gently. He looked at her, saw understanding and forgiveness in her gaze. The children exchanged curious glances, and Nancy smiled softly, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I promise you," Brian continued, voice firmer now, "from here on out, I'll do better. I'll be here. I'll listen. I'll make room in my life for what truly matters: our family, our love, our happiness together. No more taking any of you for granted." A silence followed, not awkward, but full and meaningful. Mary's smile was tender, tears at the corners of her eyes. "We love you," she said simply, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "That's all we've ever wanted, to know we matter to you." Max cleared his throat, pretending to be unaffected, but his grin gave him away. Sarah reached out to hold her father's hand, her small fingers warm against his. Nancy nodded, blinking back tears. "That's a promise worth keeping," she said softly. They lingered at the table long after the food was gone, talking and laughing in the candlelight. At some point, Sarah climbed into Brian's lap, telling him a silly story about a duck with two hats, and he chuckled, holding her close, marveling at her childish imagination. Max showed him the photos he took, blurry images of Nancy tossing a ring, Mary smiling mid-laugh, Brian pushing Sarah on a swing. Each picture a piece of evidence that love surrounded them. When the children drifted off to bed, hugs and goodnights exchanged, Brian and Mary remained downstairs with Nancy a bit longer, sharing quiet reflections. Eventually, Nancy excused herself, leaving the couple alone in the dim living room. Mary leaned her head on Brian's shoulder. The silence was gentle, a comforting hush after a day of laughter and revelations. Brian closed his eyes, feeling Mary's warmth beside him. He had almost lost sight of this, the sweetness of a normal evening, the gentle hush of a home at rest, the future open and forgiving. He drew Mary closer, whispering, "Thank you for everything." She responded by lacing her fingers with his and squeezing softly. They sat like that for a while, breathing in unison, each beat of their hearts a quiet promise renewed. Upstairs, the children slept, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would dawn on a family brought closer by a day of unexpected grace. Downstairs, Brian and Mary remained side by side, savoring the gift of each other's presence. He felt lighter than he had in years, certain that, come what may, he would never again take this fragile miracle of togetherness for granted. Part 8. New Beginnings. Brian pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine, sitting for a moment behind the wheel. He recognized this place as if from a distant memory. Fellows Manor, a long-term care facility. Its brick facade and carefully trimmed hedges looked exactly as he had pictured. Part of him wondered if he'd imagined it, but here it stood, tangible and quiet in the midday light. He walked up the path, gravel crunching underfoot. The air smelled faintly of cut grass. Inside, the lobby's hush washed over him, muffling the world outside. The receptionist glanced up, surprised by this well-dressed stranger who seemed to know exactly where he was going. Brian offered a polite greeting, asked for a resident named Jake. The receptionist blinked, startled. Jake? No one visited Jake, but she gave a room number anyway, curiosity etched in her eyes. Through silent corridors he walked, passing pastel walls and framed landscapes. He noticed little touches, fresh flowers on a table, a bulletin board filled with cheerful notes from volunteers. The staff moved with quiet efficiency, offering smiles as he passed. He imagined their surprise when they saw him enter Jake's room, a door at the end of a hall, as anonymous as any other. He reached for the knob, breathing steadily, and stepped inside. The room welcomed him with a familiar stillness. 2 beds, the hum of medical devices, and a faint antiseptic scent in the air. Jake lay on the far side, just as Brian remembered, unmoving, his eyes open but unfocused. A nurse who'd been straightening blankets froze, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement. A visitor? For Jake? Brian inclined his head, a gentle acknowledgement. She offered a stunned smile, then slipped out, probably to tell the others. He approached Jake's bedside slowly, pulling up a chair to sit close. His heart thumped, not with dread, but with purpose. This time, he was here willingly, not by circumstance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and spoke softly. "Hello, Jake," he said, voice calm. The man before him gave no visible response, but Brian knew better than to take that as absence. There was humanity here, in the steady rise and fall of Jake's chest, in the faint creases of his brow. Brian talked about the day's warmth, the neatly kept garden he'd seen outside, the quiet corridors of Fellows Manor. He mentioned that he'd come to say hello, to let Jake know he was not forgotten. Nurses gathered discreetly near the doorway, whispering to each other. Brian pretended not to notice. Instead, he told Jake about recent changes in his life, how he'd decided to set a different course, to make choices guided by empathy and fairness. He didn't dwell on details, simply promising that from now on, he intended to honor the dignity of every person he encountered, to respect stories he might never fully know. After some time, Brian stood to leave. He pressed a gentle hand on Jake's arm, a quiet farewell. As he exited, the staff hovered, still astonished. One nurse mustered the courage to approach, asking if he'd return. Brian nodded, saying he would drop by again, bring something nice for Jake's side of the room. Maybe a book, even if Jake couldn't hold it, just so someone could read to him. He left behind a wave of quiet wonder, the staff stunned that Jake finally had someone who cared to visit. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer on his face. Brian breathed deeply, stepping off the curb toward his car with a lighter stride. He had made a promise to himself, and today's visit affirmed it. He would not be the man who looked away, who justified cruelty with convenience. He would not make decisions that harmed others just because it was easier. He wanted to do right by people, known or unknown, capable or vulnerable. Back at his office, he stood before the tall glass doors, reflections of the street dancing on their surface. Inside, the firm bustled as always, assistants on phones, clients waiting in sleek chairs, colleagues hurrying with files tucked under their arms. Once, he had relished the energy for its own sake. Now he walked through it feeling a sense of responsibility. He reached his private office, closed the door, and sat down. The polished desk bore stacks of claims and documents, contracts and letters waiting for his review. He sifted through them, looking for one name in particular: Sam Hitchens. He recalled the file, a case they had nearly strangled with old statutes and obscure policies. Before, Brian might have deemed it too risky to approve. But now he understood that what mattered was justice and fairness, not twisting laws to deny someone their rightful support. He found Sam's file and opened it carefully. The details lay bare: an injury, financial need, a family struggling to pay bills. This claim would mean hope for them. In the past, his firm would have shredded that hope behind legal smoke. But no more. Brian reached for his pen and signed his approval, a clear and deliberate signature that symbolized a new direction. Over the next weeks, he took steps to guide his firm toward a more ethical approach. He met with his associates, explaining that they would no longer profit from loopholes designed to hurt the vulnerable. Some shook their heads, baffled by his sudden shift. Others argued it would slash profits, drive away certain high-paying clients. Brian listened calmly, acknowledging their concerns, and reiterated his stance. Integrity would define them now. There were losses at first. A few big clients, accustomed to ruthless tactics, left in search of a more compliant partner. It stung, but Brian did not waver. He assured his employees that while short-term profits might dip, their reputation would grow. Word would spread that this firm upheld fairness, that they treated every claim as a human story, not a case number. At internal meetings, he emphasized training on ethical guidelines. He encouraged staff to speak up if they felt a decision was unjust. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Some colleagues thanked him quietly, relieved to work without a knot in their stomachs. Others, new hires drawn by the firm's evolving reputation, brought fresh enthusiasm. Brian's office no longer hummed with calculated tension. Instead, it resonated with genuine purpose. And then the tide turned. Clients came seeking a firm they could trust. Small businesses looking for honest counsel. Individuals wanting fair representation. Even larger corporations that realized a partnership built on ethics lasted longer than one rooted in shady deals. Brian watched as the quarterly reports arrived. Steadily, profits climbed, fueled by a stable, loyal client base. But money mattered less to him now. What mattered was seeing his staff hold their heads high, confident in the work they did. What mattered was knowing that people like Sam Hitchens no longer ended up on the losing side just because they lacked clout. Outside of work, Brian carried his new principles into everyday life. He spent more time with Mary and the children, ensuring weekends were for family adventures and quiet evenings for conversation. He met Nancy regularly, sharing meals and stories, sometimes inviting her to dinners where laughter and kindness filled every corner of the room. There was no special occasion needed. He had learned that ordinary moments held extraordinary value. He returned to Fellows Manor regularly, a pattern that puzzled some but delighted the staff. Each visit, he brought something for Jake: a soft blanket in warm colors, a wind-up music box that played a gentle melody, a small vase of fresh flowers to add color to the room. He spoke to Jake about his firm's progress, how they were changing lives by doing right. He described clients who came back smiling, relief in their eyes, grateful for honest service. He mentioned that Sam Hitchens got the support he deserved and could breathe easy now. He knew Jake could not respond, but he believed his words mattered, acknowledging that Jake, too, mattered. Over time, Jake's room lost its sterile emptiness. Small personal touches, courtesy of Brian's visits, made it feel less like a forgotten corner and more like a place where someone cared. The nurses would find Brian seated there, reading a magazine aloud or simply humming softly. They never intruded, only nodded approvingly. The facility's director even approached Brian one day, thanking him for recognizing Jake's humanity. Brian felt humbled, shaking the director's hand and assuring them he was the one who owed gratitude. Jake had taught him, in his silence, that everyone deserved compassion. In the office, Brian continued to refine policies. He introduced transparent fee structures, clearer communication with clients, and pro bono work for those in need. Some staff worried about the bottom line, but Brian's steady leadership and the growing respect of their clients eased their fears. Soon, they found themselves the firm of choice for people who wanted fairness and honesty, who recommended the company to friends and colleagues. The brand Brian once forged out of cunning and legal acrobatics now thrived on empathy and moral grounding. Occasionally, Brian's mind drifted to what might have been if he had never changed course. He remembered a time when he chased success at any cost, when he saw people as numbers on a ledger, when his family's smiles were background noise he hardly registered. Now, he lived differently. Each small, kind decision felt like another step along a path he wanted to follow forever. On a crisp morning months later, Brian stood in his office, looking out the window. Sunlight brushed the city skyline. He thought about his day's schedule, meetings with clients, a lunch with a community outreach group, an early departure to watch Max's basketball game, and read Sarah a chapter from her new book. He smiled, feeling at peace. The choices he made now aligned with values he cherished. He would guide his firm to be known not just for technical skill, but for doing what was right, time and again. That afternoon, before he left for the game, Brian picked up the phone and dialed Fellows Manor. A nurse answered, pleased to hear his voice. He asked if Jake was having a good day, if there was anything new he could bring tomorrow. The nurse laughed softly, saying that Jake seemed calmer these days. Perhaps that was Brian's imagination, or just her interpretation, but it warmed his heart. He promised to return soon. After he hung up, he locked his office door and walked down the hall, greeting his employees by name, pausing to congratulate a junior associate on a well-handled claim, and thanking an assistant for her hard work. He recognized that these relationships were delicate gifts, nurtured by respect and understanding. Outside, he headed to his car, thinking about the smile on Mary's face when he arrived home early, the bright excitement in his children's eyes as they showed him their latest accomplishments. He had discovered that shaping a life of empathy and fairness was not a single grand gesture, but a series of small choices made daily. He had found meaning not in the pursuit of ruthless success, but in the quiet moments of kindness that left no one behind. And with each gentle step along this new path, he built a legacy far more lasting than any fortune or accolade could provide. Brian turned the ignition and pulled into traffic, the city unfolding around him. Fellows Manor existed as a beacon in his mind, a place he visited to remind himself that everyone deserved recognition and care. His firm's growing reputation confirmed that honesty and ethics could thrive in the business world, and his family, waiting at home, grounded him with love and warmth. He would keep moving forward, certain that every kind decision, every fair verdict, every thoughtful visit built something better. From now on, he would live by the vow he made to himself, forging a future defined by compassion and justice. And as he drove beneath the fading afternoon sky, Brian knew he had found his true direction. The end.